I never thought I'd be in a 1957 Chevy Bel Air in the middle of Havana, Cuba. This car has no airbags, no seatbelts, no door handles, but it's still the coolest thing ever. As an avid world traveler, Cuba is like this travel relic. It's been cut off from the US since the early 1960s, and Americans have been restricted from stepping foot on this island. But things are changing.
Ending decades of Cold War tensions with Cuba is fast approaching. Later this morning in the Rose Garden, the president will announce the U.S.
Today, I can announce that the United States has agreed to formally reestablish diplomatic relations with the Republic of Cuba. This is a historic step forward in our efforts to normalize relations with the Cuban government and people.
There are a lot of ways to normalize relations with Cuba, like letting businesses trade goods with each other and allowing mail service to start between the two countries. Another way is to stop making it illegal for US citizens to go to Cuba. For the last 50 years, Americans who traveled there faced a $250,000 fine and 10 years in prison. The law was rarely enforced, but this made going to Cuba difficult because there was no way to fly directly into the country from the US. But last summer, things started to happen.
History was made high in the sky today with the first commercial flight from the U.S. to Cuba in more than 50 years. It's a new chapter in the thawing relations between our two countries after ties were restored last year.
Now, more than 8 airlines fly direct into Cuba every day. Most flights depart from Florida, so you'll most likely have a layover in Miami or Fort Lauderdale, like I did. But one thing that hasn't normalized yet are things like financial transactions. If you're an American, your debit or credit card won't work in any of the shops, ATMs, or banks.
I knew that my ATM card was not going to work. I heard stories from people who didn't factor this in and they got screwed over not having money or having to get money wired somehow. My name is John Barr. I'm a travel vlogger.
John was just in Cuba not too long ago. He helped me understand the money situation for Americans visiting the island. Since the two countries haven't completely normalized relations, exchanging US dollars for Cuban currency is very expensive.
There's a 10% penalty for using US dollars at an exchange house. I went for 2 weeks. For me, it made sense to go from US dollars to Canadian.
John exchanged his US dollars in the US for Canadian dollars before going to Cuba. The currency exchange fee is around 3%. Exchanging Canadian dollars to Cuban pesos is another 3% fee. So in total, it cost him 6% in fees to exchange US dollars into Canadian dollars and then to Cuban pesos. This is still cheaper than exchanging US dollars directly into Cuban pesos, which will cost you the exchange fee plus the 10% penalty, totaling 13%. At the Havana Airport exchange booth, I had the first of many of what I would call under-the-table encounters. Encounters where local Cubans conduct business in some way that wasn't legal. When I got to the booth, there was no one behind the counter. A police officer standing to the side asked me what I wanted to exchange. I still had some US dollars that I forgot to exchange earlier, and the officer told me that I should speak with this lady standing near the booth. When I approached her, she said she could offer me a US dollar exchange rate for 10% instead of the standard 13%. We walked into a small office nearby and did the exchange. Like I said earlier, Americans can't use their credit or debit cards in Cuba, so you're going to have to bring enough cash with you to last you for the duration of your trip.
I brought more than enough cash. I brought more cash than I needed, so in my 2 weeks, I never ran into any money problems.
I spent an entire month in Cuba, so I brought a lot of cash with me. It can feel a little sketchy traveling with that much money, but right now there aren't other options for Americans. One thing I did to avoid carrying even more cash on me was booking places to stay in advance. You can do this online through Airbnb or other online booking sites. Cuba doesn't have that many hotels, so you're most likely going to stay in what's called a casa particular.
Casa particulars are essentially a chance for pretty much any local to open up their homes to tourists, and basically you can tell that it's a casa particular because they have the blue cross on the outside.
It's like maybe 2 years ago, I think they were just allowed to host people in their homes.
Here's Elizabeth Vyatkin. She's another travel vlogger I spoke to.
It wasn't like that a couple years ago, but right now, if you just walk around Havana, you can see practically on every door, there's this little sign that says Casa Particular, and like you can just knock on any door you want and they're just going to let you in.
They'll let you in if they have availability, and you'll find that the prices can range from $20 to $50 a night. I've been to 6 different casas in Cuba, and the quality can be pretty hit or miss, but all of them have the basics.
The casas actually are pretty strictly licensed. You have to have running water. Most of them have to have air conditioning too, because most tourists are not going to go to Cuba and not have air conditioning. So they're actually pretty tightly controlled by the government, but essentially it's just a way for local Cubans to get into capitalism a little bit and try to make some extra money.
Cubans have a lot of different ways of making extra money. One very lucrative way is to drive a taxi. Taxi driving is one of the best paying jobs in Cuba. This is because most Cubans earn between $20 to $200 a month, but just one cab fare from the Havana airport to the city of Havana can pay really well.
For a taxi from the airport to Old Havana, it was between 25 to 30 pesos. Hi, I'm Andrea Cristina, and I'm a travel and beauty blogger.
And like she said, the going rate for a ride is 25 to 30 pesos. And these pesos are worth as much as dollars. We'll get more into the Cuban currency in the next episode. So basically, a cab driver in Cuba can earn in one ride what some Cubans make in an entire month. I spent my first week in Havana in an area called El Cerro. It's a residential neighborhood with a lot of vehicle and pedestrian traffic. In most of Havana, it feels like people are always heading somewhere. It's a very busy city. Now, locals spend a lot of time outdoors, either sitting in front of their homes or hanging out on a corner talking. The culture is very inclusive here, and the people are really, really friendly. Every day, I went into an area called Old Havana. It's where the city was first founded. Some of the buildings here are hundreds of years old, and you can find a lot of museums and restaurants there too.
It's close to everything, and it's very, very walkable, especially if you're just like a girl. It's very safe. It's, more lit up. You're closer to restaurants. That's where most of the hotels, the Wi-Fi is easy to find.
Easy to find Wi-Fi is a huge, huge perk when you're in Cuba. So there's currently no data service for cell phones, so it really doesn't matter how much you're willing to pay. There's no possible way for you to surf the web on your phone without Wi-Fi. Now, you'll know when you're near a Wi-Fi hotspot when you see at least a dozen or more people standing around looking at their smartphones. These areas are called Wi-Fi parks. If you want to use the internet here, you'll have to buy a Wi-Fi card with a scratch-off code and a password. They're called Atexa cards and will cost you about 2 to 6 pesos, depending on how many hours of Wi-Fi the card has. Most cards you'll buy will have an hour's worth of internet on it, but it can be a really big hassle using these things. I mean, you might get kicked off of the network several times, and it could even take you up to 5 to 10 minutes just to connect. Now, the Casa Particular that I was staying at wasn't near a Wi-Fi park, so I'd have to set an hour of my day aside to travel to the park. Here's John again.
So, essentially the internet over there was more of an activity than something you were always connected to. Like, I would find time in the evening if I had nothing better to do to go to one of the public squares and try to get internet, but it didn't always work. And I think that internet use is probably one of the biggest frustrations for most people I've met who've gone to Cuba, especially if they've gone for more than a week. You've lived 10 consecutive years with a smartphone glued to your hip. And when you get off the internet for a while, at first it's liberating, and then after a while it starts to get a little bit annoying.
But limited access to the internet can have its perks.
When you don't have a smartphone and the internet isn't as important in your life, I think community relations are a little bit different. I think neighbors were more friendly. I would walk down the street at night and people who recognized me would call to me and just say, come over, come say hi, because I was there for 11 days. I remember one of the friends of the family called me over. I sat down. She offered me a drink. We were just chatting. I felt like just the community was pretty tight-knit just because they weren't distracted by other things.
Without very much internet, Cubans rely on their communities for information and knowledge. And since they don't update their Facebook relationship statuses, locals use their community to find out this stuff too. Here's what Elizabeth had to say.
It's like the country is held together by gossip, and it's like everybody knows everything about everybody else. And it's just this crazy, like, it's like apparently it's like living in a soap opera. And you just have to be in the know all the time because that's where all valuable information comes from. Not only like gossip wise, but like who has the new shipment of avocados coming or something, you know.
This sort of tight-knit community probably helps keep Cuba very safe. I've traveled to many places in the world, and despite how economically poor Cuba is, it's felt like the safest place I've ever been.
It's so safe. It's amazing. We're walking around at night through like really dark little alleys, and you see like a bunch of like young guys, like 5 young guys just like sitting around and like looking at you, but you don't even like feel unsafe. In any other country, I'd be like, oh, am I about to get robbed as like the very obvious tourist in the dark alley somewhere? Over there, that thought doesn't even cross your mind. You're like, no, it's fine. It's all safe.
John felt the same way about Cuba and has his own take as to why it's safe there.
With communism there, nobody owns guns except the military or the police. And not a lot of wage disparity per se, again, because of the whole communist thing. So just a lot of the reasons for street crime in other countries, as far as like, someone with lower income needing it, or a lot of gun use in the United States, those reasons for crime don't really exist.
In Cuba, most people make less than $300 a month, so they don't have neighborhoods that are poor and some that are middle class and some that are wealthy. Since all neighborhoods are pretty much the same, you don't really have to worry about walking into a potentially sketchy area. I've also heard from a local that the Cuban police are really strict about crime against tourists. He told me a story about 2 tourists who were kidnapped in the town of Vinales around 8 years ago. The kidnappers held them overnight and raped them. The next day, they dropped the 2 victims off in town and the kidnappers drove away. The tourists went immediately to the police station, and the police were stunned to hear that this had happened. This sort of crime was so rare that the Vinales police called all the surrounding police stations to activate a search for the criminals. The cops went door to door searching for clues and suspects. Within 24 hours, both men were caught and identified by the tourists. The criminals were both executed that same day. The Cuban who told me this story said that Vinales is a really small town, and they're really, really dependent on the income that they earn from the tourism industry, so they couldn't afford their reputation getting hurt if news like this got out. I'm sure that's a really rare story, and it's also unverified, but moral of the story, Cubans take crime very, very seriously, so you'll be generally safe there. Another thing that Cubans take very seriously are their cars. After the US trade embargo in the early 1960s, Cubans couldn't buy American cars. Russian cars were available, but they were rationed, so there weren't that many for sale. The only way to buy a car was through the government, and they were very expensive because of how much Cuba taxed new cars. With such little income, Cubans couldn't afford new cars for decades, so instead they just repair their old ones over and over. That's why you'll see so many old cars in photos of Cuba. Some of these cars can have parts from 4 or 5 different vehicles. Some of them have boat engines or even lawnmower engines to keep them on the road. One car I saw looked like it was from the 1950s, but on the inside the steering wheel said Toyota on it. Most of these old cars that you see in Havana will operate as some sort of taxi. In old Havana, you'll find a lot of the nicer ones that look fancy and have shiny paint jobs. Those can be really expensive to ride in.
But if you get like a really shitty one that's like with a not so good paint job and like the seats in the back that you're like bouncing, like your head almost like touches the ceiling every pothole, then it's fine. It's just regular taxis.
These taxis are called Collectivos. The fare is really cheap, about 80 cents, but don't expect them to have any safety features like airbags.
Yeah, I've never seen a car with a seatbelt in Cuba. Never.
I haven't seen one either, and getting into pretty much any car in Cuba is going to have its risks. Now, there's a method to hailing down one of these Collectivos. Here's John again.
There's certain pickup spots, and you have to point to the ground, and then they pull over, and you just make sure they're going in the direction that you want. And usually there's like 3 or 4 people inside already. When I did it, I think there was 3 of us or 4 of us. The guy talked so fast I could barely understand him. So I hopped in. I got a ride in an old 1950s car, and we got downtown. I think the same ride that would have cost me $10 8 to 10 kook cost me like 30 cents. And that was actually one of the highlights of my entire time in Havana, just doing the local Collectivo ride. I felt like a Cuban for at least like 10 minutes, yeah.
These pickup spots are usually on one of the main roads in Havana. You'll know if you're in the right spot when you see people sticking their hand out for a ride. Most Collectivos won't veer off of their route. They're not going to drop you off exactly where you want to go. They simply drive back and forth along the same road, picking up and dropping people off along the way. But some of these Collectivos do act as a private taxi. They'll take you anywhere in Havana for about $4 to $10. Like I said earlier, driving a taxi can earn people a lot of money in Cuba, so cars are very valuable to them. Families will even pass down their one car through several generations. To give you an idea of how important these cars are, Elizabeth told me a conversation she had with one of her cab drivers.
This taxi driver we had, he said like, oh yeah, I bought this car. It's like it was like a 1996 Peugeot that he bought like already 10 years used. He bought it in like 2006. And he says, oh, I paid like 30,000 kooks for it. And right now somebody's offering me 40,000 kooks. And I don't want to sell it to him. And for me, that doesn't make any sense. But that's just the market because there are no cars. And he makes a living, like he maybe makes $100 a day driving people around. I was telling him, well, why don't you sell it? You'll have like 40,000 cooks. And he's like, well, how am I going to live then without the car? How am I going to like buy food? That's my livelihood.
The livelihood of Cubans are dictated by their resourcefulness. They figure out ways to fix things in really creative ways. And they also put a lot of value in little things like gifts and trinkets.
Bring some small gifts with you. Bring postcards, bring t-shirts, bring toys for kids. These are people who are probably never going to leave their country. Bring a little bit of where you're from to Cuba and you're going to feel great. You're going to see the smiles on their faces when you explain you got a postcard of the Empire State Building. It's pretty cool.
There are so many important things to know about Cuba before you travel there. Like, why do they have two currencies? What's it like outside of Havana? And what's the food like? And the coffee? And the cigars? We'll cover all of these things in our next Cuba episode. Thank you, Andrea, John, and Elizabeth for being a part of this episode. We'll have links for their vlogs and social media accounts on our website at gothepodcast.com. Subscribe to the podcast and check out our Instagram and website to see pictures of some of the things that we talked about in this episode. I'm Alex Swolinski. Thank you for listening.